Number 15, let's look for something that would logically complete the argument. Let's see if we can predict this. So the argument says the introduction of mass production techniques in modern industrial economies allowed the owners of industries to lower their prices because they can employ fewer workers, many of whom didn't require that much training. So mass production techniques was good for a lot of these industries because they could employ fewer workers who didn't need that much training. And the lower prices allowed workers to buy goods that they previously wouldn't have been able to afford. So the lower prices were good for the workers as well. But here's the flip side. But since jobs for workers with little training, which is what's been happening here, right? We were able to employ fewer workers, many of whom required little training. We're saying that was, so far we're saying that was an improvement. But now we're saying since jobs for workers with little training are more vulnerable to elimination than jobs for more highly trained workers, what? What would it make sense to finish this paragraph with? Basically something that ties this all together, because in the first part of the paragraph, we basically said that these mass production techniques allowed the owners of industries to lower prices, and those lower prices were good for the workers, right? So it was a benefit. But then we said, but that same advance also made those workers' jobs more vulnerable to elimination, right? That's basically the second part of the paragraph. That last sentence is introducing a downside. So we have the upside in the first couple sentences, and then we have the downside. So something that ties everything together at the end of the paragraph would make the most sense, right? This introduction of mass production techniques was good for the workers because the lower prices allowed them to buy things that they wouldn't have been able to afford. But since it also makes their jobs more vulnerable to elimination, right? It gives them less job security. Therefore, what? We just have to tie those two things together somehow. Something that was good for them in one way, aka lowering prices for them, allowing them to afford more things, was also bad for them in another way, aka making their jobs less secure, more vulnerable to elimination. Something like that would make the most sense because it would tie together everything that we have said, right? That's the connection, that's the contrast between the first thing we said is that it's good for workers in a way because it allows them to afford more stuff, but then we said, however, it's bad for them because it makes their jobs more vulnerable. I think you get the point. Let's go ahead and look for something like that in the answers. A, would this complete the argument logically to say that, let's read the sentence, but since jobs for workers with little training are less secure, they're more vulnerable to elimination than for highly trained workers, A, highly trained workers therefore must have more purchasing power in modern industrial economies than less trained workers. This doesn't really make sense. We never talk about the purchasing power of highly trained workers, right? We do talk about the purchasing power of the workers in the paragraph who are being affected by the lower prices. It has nothing to do with whether they're highly trained or lowly trained. It has to do with the fact that the prices were lowered and therefore the workers can now afford more than what they used to be able to afford, right? But there's no comparison anywhere in this paragraph between the purchasing power of highly trained workers versus the purchasing power of less trained workers. That doesn't seem to make sense. It also has nothing to do with the first half of the sentence. The first half of the sentence is saying since their jobs are more vulnerable to elimination, therefore something about the purchasing power of highly trained workers, which are not even the people we're talking about, that doesn't really make sense. So A is wrong. B, would it make sense to conclude the paragraph by saying, but since jobs for workers with little training are less secure than those for more highly trained workers, therefore B, the introduction of mass production techniques has decreased benefits for workers as it has increased the profits for owners of industries? This is going a little too far, because we haven't necessarily decreased benefits for workers. It sounds like we made things better for them in one way, and we made things worse for them in another way, right? We made things better for them because they're able to afford more, they have more purchasing power, right? But we've also made their jobs less secure. So we've made it better for them in one way, we've made it worse for them in another way. That doesn't mean that we've decreased their benefits overall. That's a little too bold of a statement, right? So I don't know, meaning this is just one way we made things better for them, one way we've made things worse for them. Maybe there's 98 other ways that we made things better for them. Maybe there's a whole bunch of other benefits that we gave them, and maybe overall this was a huge plus for them, right? Or maybe not. We simply don't know. We only have two things that change for them, one positive, one negative. It's not enough to extrapolate what B is saying, which is that we've decreased benefits for them overall, right? And The second part of B is also kind of another elephant in the room. There's two elephants in the room, as it were. We never were told in this paragraph that we increase the profits for owners of industries. What does it say? This kind of sounds sort of like what it's saying in the first sentence of the paragraph. What does that sentence actually say? It says that these mass production techniques allowed the owners of industries to lower prices because they could employ fewer workers, many of whom required little training. It doesn't say it increased their profits anywhere, though. Just because they lowered prices doesn't mean they increased profits, right? That doesn't necessarily, one thing doesn't mean the other, right? So that's another major issue with B. At any rate, B is clearly not going to be the right answer here. C says that the paragraph should end by saying, even the highest paid employees in modern economies are never able to have job security. There's no evidence for that in this paragraph, right? The paragraph basically says in the last sentence that jobs for workers with little training are more vulnerable to elimination, meaning they are less secure than those for highly trained workers, right? So C, according to C, that since that's true, since the workers with little training have less job security than the workers who are highly trained, therefore C, even the highest paid employees don't have job security? First of all, this sentence isn't talking about how much they're being paid or how little they're being paid. It's about workers who have little training versus workers who have a lot of training, right? So when it says even the highest paid employees, that's kind of random because that's a new variable, first of all. But second of all, no one's able to achieve job security, even the highest paid employees, meaning no one's able to achieve job security. That doesn't seem to flow from the first half of the sentence at the end of the paragraph, which is saying that workers with little training have less job security than those for highly trained workers. So it does sound like maybe the highly trained workers at least have job security. It doesn't sound like nobody has job security. So therefore, C doesn't really make sense. It's not flowing from the information in the paragraph. D, would it make sense to conclude the paragraph by saying, let's read the sentence from the paragraph first, the first half of the sentence, but since jobs for workers with little training are more vulnerable to elimination than jobs of highly trained workers, therefore D, it must be that a source of increased purchasing power for workers in modern industrial economies is also undermining their job security. Yeah, that has to be true, because what have we just said in this paragraph? That introduction of mass production techniques on the one hand has increased the purchasing power of workers in these modern industrial economies, right? That's what it says in the first couple sentences, specifically the second sentence, right? It says the lower prices that are caused by or that are allowed by these new techniques allow the workers to buy more things. It increases their purchasing power. But the last sentence says, but since now they don't need that much training and jobs with little training are more vulnerable to elimination. So in other words, it increased their purchasing power, but it made their jobs more vulnerable to elimination. And therefore, it must be true that D, this source of increased purchasing power, also undermined their job security. What is that source? The introduction of mass production techniques, which, again, gave them increased purchasing power, but it also undermined their job security. It made their jobs more vulnerable to elimination. Why? Because jobs for workers with little training are more vulnerable to elimination, as the first half of the sentence says. So this flows perfectly, pretty much summarizes everything we've said in this paragraph, and therefore it is the answer. E says that the paragraph should conclude by saying that the percentage of workers who can afford to purchase goods produced by modern industrial techniques must be shrinking. Now, that doesn't really flow from what we were given in the paragraph, right? That sentence wouldn't even make sense, right? Because the first half of the sentence had to do with job security, right? It said, but since jobs for workers with little training have less job security than those of highly trained workers, therefore E, the percentage of workers who can afford to purchase goods made by modern industrial techniques must be decreasing. The two things have nothing to do with each other, right? One is about job security, and E is about purchasing power. And there's no evidence anywhere in the paragraph, aside from that, there's no evidence anywhere in the paragraph that E is even true, right? Where would that have come from here, right? How do we know that the percentage of workers who can afford to buy these goods, it used to be 60%, but now it's only 53%, right? There's no evidence anywhere in this paragraph. It kind of sounds like more people can afford more things as a result of these new techniques, right? It sounds like the lower prices allowed workers to buy goods that they previously wouldn't have been able to afford. So it sounds like purchasing power is improving, not the other way around. Therefore, E doesn't really make sense for a couple reasons. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.